My own sister destroyed my life. She poisoned our grandfather, framed me, and stole our $150 million inheritance. I was sent to prison for a crime I didn't commit. But when I got out, she never saw it coming. I never imagined that my life, carefully built with discipline and hard work, could crumble so quickly. But when your own family turns against you, when those closest to you betray you for money, you realize how fragile everything truly is. My name is Nancy Reynolds. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent my life earning everything I have. While my family has always lived under the shadow of wealth, dependent on my grandfather's fortune, I chose to take a different path. I worked my way through college, landed a job in finance, and climbed my way up to become a senior finance executive in Seattle. I never relied on anyone, never expected handouts, and most importantly, I never lived a life of illusion. Unlike me, my older sister, Sophia, was the opposite. She was once a TV news anchor, but when that career faded, she reinvented herself as a socialite in Los Angeles. To the world, she was elegant, charming, always perfectly dressed, always attending exclusive parties. But I knew the truth. Her entire lifestyle was paid for by our grandfather, William Reynolds. Without his money, she was nothing. Our parents, Daniel and Margaret, were no different. They had settled in Los Angeles, living a comfortable life in a luxury estate, but not because of their own success. Everything, from their home to their cars, even their extravagant vacations, was funded by my grandfather. They acted as if they had built their own wealth, but in reality, they were nothing more than well-dressed dependents, pretending to be something they weren't. And then there was grandfather William Reynolds, the man who built everything. He had started as a struggling real estate developer and turned himself into one of the most successful businessmen in the country. His fortune was vast, his properties stretched across multiple states, and yet, despite his wealth, he always valued one thing above all: independence. Earn your own way, he used to tell me, because the moment you rely on others, they own you. I had always lived by those words. But my sister, my parents, they never listened. That's why I knew Thanksgiving was always a game. Every year, my family gathered at the Monarch Hotel, a five-star resort in Los Angeles, for a lavish, expensive celebration, all paid for by grandfather. It was a tradition, but for my parents and sister, it was more than that. It was an opportunity to impress, to pretend they were something greater than they really were. I arrived at the hotel on Thanksgiving morning, exhausted from my flight, but mentally prepared. I always hated these gatherings, but I attended for grandfather. He was the only one in my family who truly understood me, the only one who ever encouraged me to be independent. I checked in, placed my suitcase in the suite, and freshened up before heading downstairs. As I walked through the grand lobby, I spotted my parents sitting by the bar, talking in hushed voices. My mother's face lit up when she saw me, but my father barely looked at me. He had always favored Sophia, and that had never changed. Then, Sophia appeared. She was dressed in designer heels, carrying an expensive handbag, and wearing a diamond necklace that I knew she hadn't paid for herself. She walked toward me with a smug expression, as if she had already won some unspoken competition. "Nancy," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "You made it." "Of course I did," I replied. "Where's grandfather?" Sophia's smile faltered. "He's resting," she said after a pause. A strange feeling crept into my chest. Something was off. As dinner approached, I started to worry. Grandfather always arrived early to these events, always eager to see me, always full of life. But as the night stretched on, he never showed up. Then, just as the servers were preparing dessert, a hotel staff member approached the table and whispered something to my father. My mother gasped. My father's face turned pale. And then I knew. Something terrible had happened. The next thing I heard was a single sentence that sent a chill through my bones. "Your grandfather has passed away." The room spun. My heart pounded. The words didn't make sense. "He was fine yesterday," I whispered. I spoke to him. But no one met my gaze. Sophia dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, but there were no real tears. My mother, usually dramatic about the smallest inconvenience, was eerily composed. My father sighed and rubbed his temple, as if this were nothing more than an unfortunate event to be managed. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Grandfather was gone, and yet no one seemed truly shocked. The funeral was held 2 days later, a grand affair with important guests and carefully arranged tributes. But through all the eulogies, the condolences, and the empty words, something gnawed at me. Something wasn't right. And then came the will reading. I sat in the law office, still numb from grief, waiting to hear my grandfather's final wishes. His lawyer, a man who had worked with him for decades, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. As per Mr. William Reynolds' final will, the majority of his estate, his businesses, his financial assets, and his properties will be inherited by... He looked up directly at me. Nancy Reynolds. A stunned silence filled the room. My mother's lips parted, but no words came out. My father turned red, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. And then there was Sophia. Her expression, for the first time, was stripped of all pretense. She was furious. I was meant to inherit everything. Not her. Not my parents.
Me.
Before I could even process the weight of those words, Sophia spoke, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. This doesn't make sense, she snapped. Grandfather never said anything about this. But the lawyer simply folded his hands and continued. The will was updated a month ago. Mr. Reynolds believed that Nancy was the only one in the family who shared his values, the only one capable of running his empire responsibly. Sophia's hands clenched into fists. My mother reached for her pearls as if clutching them would make reality change. My father stared at me with pure resentment. And then I realized something. My grandfather had always been healthy. His mind had always been sharp. His death had come out of nowhere. And now, after his passing, Sophia was the one acting as if something had been stolen from her. That's when I knew. Grandfather's death was no accident. The moment I walked out of that office, I knew I had to find the truth. My grandfather had always been a strong, sharp-minded man. He was careful with his health, cautious with his business, and above all, he never trusted blindly. There was no reason for him to suddenly collapse and die, unless someone had helped make it happen. And there was only one person who had everything to gain from his death. Sophia. I didn't say anything at first. I let them think I was still in shock, still trying to process the news. But inside, I was burning. As we left the law office, Sophia walked beside me, her arms crossed, her mouth set in a tight line. I could feel her watching me, waiting for a reaction. "This changes nothing," she finally said, her voice low and controlled. I stopped walking and turned to face her. "It changes everything." Her lips curled into a cold smile. "You think you're in control now, Nancy? That this money, this power, actually belongs to you?" She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You have no idea what you've just stepped into." I held my ground. "Neither do you." I didn't need to hear anything else. I already knew she was guilty. The problem was proving it. Over the next few days, I started digging. I made calls to my grandfather's doctors, looking for anything suspicious. The medical report listed natural causes, but that meant nothing. If someone had tampered with his medication or slipped something into his food, it wouldn't necessarily show up without deeper testing. And that's when I found my first crack in the story. My grandfather's private nurse, someone who had worked for him for years, had suddenly quit 2 days before he died. That wasn't a coincidence. I tracked her down, called her, and asked to meet. At first, she refused.
Said she didn't want to get involved.
"Please," I told her, my voice barely steady. "I just want to know what really happened." She hesitated, then whispered, "He wasn't supposed to die that night." My blood ran cold. "I can't say more," she added. "But check his medication. And be careful. People like your sister, they don't like loose ends." I hung up, my hand shaking. I didn't know what scared me more, the confirmation that my grandfather had been murdered, or the fact that whoever did it was still watching. That night, I went to my grandfather's estate, searching through his things, looking for anything that felt out of place. And then, in the bottom drawer of his desk, I found it, a bottle of heart medication that he had never taken before. I knew my grandfather's prescriptions. He had always been meticulous about his health. This bottle wasn't his. Someone had replaced his real medication with something else. I stared at the bottle, my breath coming fast. This was the proof I needed. If I could get it tested, I could find out what was inside. I could expose Sophia for what she was. But I never got the chance. The next morning, I woke up to loud banging on my hotel room door. Before I could even process what was happening, the police were inside, surrounding me, pulling me out of bed. "Nancy Reynolds, you're under arrest for financial fraud and embezzlement." Everything blurred. My heart pounded, so hard I thought I might pass out. "What?" "No, this is a mistake." I tried to resist, tried to explain, but the officers weren't listening. And then I saw her, Sophia, standing just outside the hotel room, her arms crossed, watching as the police handcuffed me. She smiled. She had set me up. The next few days were a nightmare. I was dragged into an interrogation room, forced to listen as the investigators listed off evidence of my so-called crimes, forged financial documents, missing money from my grandfather's estate, accounts in my name that I had never seen before. It was all fake. I knew it. But Sophia had planned this too well. And my parents? They didn't defend me. They didn't even hesitate. When they were called in for questioning, my father sat down, folded his hands, and said coldly, "We always knew Nancy had a selfish streak." My mother nodded. Sophia has always been the responsible one. It makes sense that grandfather would trust her with everything. I wanted to scream,
To cry.
but I refused to give them that satisfaction. The trial was swift. The judge denied bail. I was convicted. And just like that, I lost everything.
My job.
My reputation. My freedom. The day they took me to the maximum security prison, I sat in the transport van, staring out the window, watching my life disappear behind me. But as I felt the cold weight of those prison walls close around me, something inside me hardened. They thought they had won. They thought they had buried me. But they underestimated me. I had lost the battle. But the war? The war was just beginning. Prison strips you of everything. Your identity, your dignity, your sense of time. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that prison doesn't break everyone. Some of us find a way to survive. And in my case, I wasn't just going to survive, I was going to fight back. The first few weeks were the hardest. The moment I walked through those gates, I could feel the weight of the stairs. Some of the other inmates saw me as fresh meat, someone easy to break. But they didn't know me. They didn't know that I had already been broken the day my own family turned on me. And when you've already lost everything, there's nothing left to fear. I kept my head down, observed, and waited. I needed a way out, not just out of prison, but out of this nightmare Sophia had created for me. I had been set up, betrayed, and buried alive, but I wasn't going to stay buried. It started with small conversations. In a place like this, you learn quickly that power doesn't just come from strength, it comes from information. I listened, made connections, and slowly began piecing together a way to clear my name. And that's how I met Detective Mark Collins. Collins had been investigating my grandfather's death before I was even arrested. He had suspected something wasn't right about how suddenly William Reynolds had passed, but before he could dig deeper, the case was shut down.
I knew why.
Sophia had made sure of it. One afternoon, Collins came to see me. He sat across the metal table, flipping through a folder, his face unreadable. Then he slid something toward me, a photo of the prescription bottle I had found in my grandfather's office. "You are onto something," he said. I stared at him, my pulse racing. "What do you mean?" "We had the pills tested. They contain traces of digoxin poisoning. In small doses, it causes heart failure. Looks like someone had been slipping it into your grandfather's medication over time." I gripped the edge of the table. There it was. The proof. But Collins wasn't finished. I also found something else. He reached into his bag and pulled out bank records, Sophia's bank records. There was a large transfer made a week before William Reynolds' death, $500, 000 deposited into an offshore account under the name of your grandfather's private nurse. My breath caught. Sophia had paid her off. She disappeared right after your arrest, Collins continued. But we've tracked her to Mexico. If I can get her to testify, we can open the case again. I exhaled slowly, my mind spinning. This was it. This was my way back. Collins looked at me seriously. I believe you, Nancy. But I need time. Stay out of trouble. Trouble found me first. That night, someone slipped a note under my cell door. No name, no handwriting. Just 3 words. Stop digging.
Now.
I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly who had sent it. Sophia may have gotten me locked up, but she wasn't done with me yet. She was watching, waiting, making sure I never made it out of here. She had underestimated me. Over the next few months, I worked with Collins and my lawyer, Adam Foster, gathering every single piece of evidence we could find. We found witnesses, a housekeeper who had seen Sophia tampering with my grandfather's drinks, an accountant who noticed money missing from his estate before his death. And finally, Collins did the impossible. He tracked down the nurse. And she was ready to talk. With all the evidence in place, Foster filed for an appeal. The hearing was scheduled, but Sophia had one last move to make. 2 nights before my court date, I was attacked in my cell. It happened fast. A woman I didn't know cornered me, shoving me hard against the wall. "You don't know when to quit," she hissed, pulling a sharpened piece of metal from her sleeve. "Sophia says you should stay put." I acted before she could strike. I twisted, slamming my elbow into her ribs, knocking the weapon from her hands. Guards rushed in, and within seconds, she was dragged away, screaming. I sat on the floor, my chest heaving. Sophia had just made her last mistake. 2 days later, I was standing in court again, but this time, I wasn't the one on trial. Foster laid out everything: the poison, the bribes, the missing money, the testimony from the nurse. Collins presented the forensic evidence, and when it was Sophia's turn to speak, she cracked. She tried to deny it, tried to twist the truth, to paint herself as the victim. But the evidence was overwhelming. Everyone in that courtroom saw her for what she was. And then, the judge gave his ruling. "Nancy Reynolds, all charges against you are dropped. You are free to go." I had won. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Sophia had stolen everything from me. My name, my life, my freedom. Now it was time to take everything from her. Walking out of that courtroom, feeling the cold air hit my skin, I should have felt free. But I didn't.
Not yet.
Freedom wasn't just about walking out of prison, it was about taking back what was stolen. And Sophia had stolen everything. My name, my life, my future. Now it was my turn. The reporters were everywhere, cameras flashing, microphones being shoved in my face. "Nancy, how do you feel about your release? What will you do now? Do you plan to press charges against your sister?" I ignored them. I had only one destination in mind: the estate my grandfather left me, the home Sophia had stolen. When I arrived, I wasn't surprised to find her there, sitting in the grand living room, swirling a glass of wine like she still owned the place. She didn't look surprised to see me either. "Well," she sighed, setting down her glass. "I was wondering when you'd show up." I took a slow step forward, my hands in my pockets. "This house isn't yours, Sophia." She smirked, but there was something off about it. She was scared. "Legally, no," she admitted. "But does that really matter? You think you can just step back into the life I built?" She laughed, but it was forced. People like me always land on their feet. I stared at her. "Is that what you think? That you're going to get away with this?" She crossed her arms. "I already have." I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. A second later, a newscaster's voice filled the room. "Breaking news. A financial investigation into Sophia Reynolds has uncovered massive fraud and theft from the William Reynolds estate. Prosecutors are now preparing formal charges, with potential sentences ranging up to 25 years in prison." Sophia's face drained of color. I kept going. "Oh, and it gets better. Turns out grandfather left a clause in his will. Anyone convicted of a felony forfeits their inheritance. I smiled, tilting my head. That means everything. The house, the money, the investments. Gone. She shot up from her seat. You're lying. I stepped forward. Check the news. I made sure every reporter in the city got the files. Sophia grabbed her phone, scrolling with shaking fingers. And then, as the reality sank in, her entire body sagged. You ruined me, she whispered. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head.
No, Sophia.
You ruined yourself. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate. Nancy, please. You don't understand what it's like. I had no choice. I laughed, cold and sharp. No choice. You killed grandfather. You framed me. You had me thrown in prison like I was trash. I stepped even closer, lowering my voice. You tried to have me killed in there. She flinched. You had a choice, I continued. And you chose greed. You chose yourself. Tears welled up in her eyes.
Please, Nancy.
Don't let them take me to prison. I can fix this. But I was already walking away. Behind me, I heard her sobbing, begging, her voice breaking apart. I never looked back. The next morning, Sophia was arrested outside that same house, her hands cuffed behind her back as reporters swarmed her. I watched from my office in Seattle, sipping my coffee. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. My parents weren't spared either. Without grandfather's money, their luxurious life crumbled overnight. They lost their home, their credit was destroyed, and soon they were forced to move into a small, rundown apartment on the outskirts of Los Angeles.
I didn't hear from them after that.
Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. I focused on rebuilding my career, and thanks to my reputation being restored, I received a job offer that was even better than the one I lost. I was back on my feet, stronger than ever. One evening, I received a letter from prison. Sophia. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single sentence. I see it now. You were always stronger than me. I folded the letter and set it aside. She was right. The ultimate betrayal had led to silent execution. Not by my hands, but by karma, justice, and the truth. And that was enough.